He shoved her from behind, hard, deliberate, in front of every camera, every soldier, every show on that base. Commander Sarah McKinley hit the mud face first. The crowd went silent. Some smirked. Some looked away. And Victor Harris stood there, chest out, waiting for her to cry, to snap, to quit. She didn't do any of those things. She stood up slowly, wiped the mud from her face, and said absolutely nothing. That silence, that was the beginning of his end. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The morning Commander Sarah McKinley drove through the front gates of Camp Ridgway. The sky was still gray, and the air smelled like diesel and wet grass. It was 4:30 hours, 30 minutes before anyone else was expected on base. That was intentional. Everything Sarah did was intentional. She parked her vehicle, pulled her bag from the back, and walked across the empty gravel lot with the kind of quiet that doesn't come from shyness. It comes from certainty. 12 years in the United States Navy, 3 combat deployments, 2 classified operations that still didn't have public names, a chest full of commendations that most men twice her age hadn't earned. Sarah McKinley had walked into rooms that were on fire and made decisions that saved lives. A joint training program in Virginia wasn't going to rattle her, but she knew something that most new commanders forget: the most dangerous battlefield isn't always the one with bullets. Sometimes it's the one with people who smile at your face and sharpen their knives behind your back. She had been briefed on the program 3 weeks earlier. The United States military, responding to years of interoperability gaps, had designed a joint SEAL Marine integration curriculum. The idea was straightforward. Take the best elements of both training cultures, put them under one roof, one standard, one evaluation structure. Find out which techniques held up under pressure, which ones didn't, and produce a new generation of operators who could communicate and execute across branch lines. On paper, it was a brilliant concept. In practice, it was a room full of alpha personalities, territorial loyalties, and decades of institutional pride, all crammed into one base with one new commander no one had asked for. That commander was Sarah. She had been selected for the role by Admiral James Caldwell himself, a man who didn't hand out leadership positions as favors. He'd reviewed her file for 15 minutes, closed it, and said 4 words to his adjutant: "Give her the program." That was it. No debate, no second interview, no committee review. Which meant to the men already at Camp Ridgway that she had come out of nowhere. And nothing makes a territorial man more dangerous than the feeling that someone took something he thought was his. Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Harris had been at Ridgway for 9 years. 9 years of building the Marine side of this program from the ground up. He had walked those training fields in the rain, in the dark, in conditions that would make most people quit on day 1. He had trained over 200 Marines who had gone on to distinguished service. He had buried 2 of them. He had written the eulogy for one. He had folded the flag at the other's funeral while the man's children watched from the front row. Victor Harris did not carry those things lightly. They had calcified inside him into something hard and immovable, a belief system that was part conviction, part scar tissue, and his belief was simple. Combat leadership belongs to those who have earned it in blood, not in classrooms, not in boardrooms, not because some admiral in Washington signed a paper. When word spread that a female Navy commander would be taking the joint program, the reaction among the senior Marine personnel was not explosive. It was quiet, the quiet of men who have decided something without needing to say it out loud. Victor said it out loud. "She's a political appointment," he told his senior NCOs the night before she arrived. They were in the mess hall late, the kind of conversation that happens when the officers are gone. Washington wants their photo opportunity, their diversity checkbox. Fine. But the moment she slows down my Marines, the moment she compromises a standard to make herself look good, I will not be quiet about it. I don't care who she knows. No one at that table disagreed. Sarah found her office in the northeast corner of the main operations building. It was smaller than the other command spaces, something she noted without comment. The desk faced a wall instead of a window, also noted. The supply requisition she'd submitted 2 weeks earlier was still pending. Noted again. She set her bag down, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and wrote one line at the top of the first page. Day 1. What do they want? A reaction? What I'll give them nothing. She capped the pen, put on her uniform, and went to meet her program. The briefing room held 47 people when she walked in, 32 Marines, 12 SEALs, and 3 administrative officers from the Joint Oversight Committee. The room fell into a specific kind of silence when she entered, not respectful silence. The kind of silence where people are exchanging glances without moving their eyes. She walked to the front of the room, set her folder on the podium, and looked out at the group for a full 5 seconds before saying a single word. Let them look. Let them calculate. Let them decide who they thought she was. Then she spoke. My name clears throat is Commander Sarah McKinley. Some of you have read my file. Some of you have already made a decision about who I am based on information that has nothing to do within my file. Both of those things are fine. I'm not here to change your opinion. I'm here to run this program. She paused. This program has one standard. Not a Navy standard, not a Marine standard, one standard. The best elements of both combined held equally by every person in this room. You will be evaluated on performance, not on branch loyalty, not on rank history, and not on personal relationships with anyone in this building. She looked across the room without lingering on any single face. Any questions before we begin? Silence. Then Victor Harris, seated in the third row, arms crossed over his chest, said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Yeah, I've got one." Sarah looked at him directly. Sergeant Harris. He didn't flinch at being recognized. If anything, it seemed to confirm something for him. Have you ever led men in live combat, not simulations, not training scenarios, actual hostile fire situations where your decisions determined whether your people came home? The room tightened. Some of the younger Marines shifted in their seats. Sarah held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. 3 deployments, she said. 2 classified, one you can look up, which I assume you already have. She tilted her head slightly. Do you have a follow-up question, or can we begin? Victor's jaw tightened. I just think the men in this room deserve to know the credentials of the person giving them orders. They have my file, Sarah said. If they want more information, they can submit a formal request to Admiral Caldwell's office. She looked back at the room. Anything else? Nothing. She opened her folder. Good. Here's what week 1 looks like. The obstacle course at Ridgeway was not designed to be completed. It was designed to be survived. 8 FT of elevation change over a 2 mi circuit with 12 technical stations. Rope climbs under time pressure. Wall breaches. Cargo net crossings. Mud crawls under wire. Weighted bag carries. Water obstacles. Log drills. And a final 400 m sprint carrying a full combat load. The target time was 22 minutes. A passing grade, elite performance was sub-18. On day clears throat 2, Sarah ran it first. She did it in 16 minutes and 44 seconds. Nobody said anything. She ran it again in the afternoon, 16:51, carrying an additional 20 lb. Corporal Darius Webb, a 24-year-old Marine who'd finished his own run at 19 minutes, watched her cross the finish line the second time and turned to the man beside him with an expression that was somewhere between confused and impressed. She didn't stop once, he said quietly. His training partner, Lance Corporal Torres, just shook his head slowly. Nobody told me about this. What they didn't know, what nobody at Ridgeway knew yet, was that Sarah had been training for this specific course for 6 weeks before she arrived. She'd obtained the layout through standard administrative request and had built Clear's Throat, her own version of every station in a private facility. She had run it 300 times in simulation. She hadn't just prepared for this program. She had prepared for every single person in it. Victor Harris escalated on day 4. Sarah arrived at the equipment bay to find her primary gear had been reorganized, tactically speaking, sabotaged. Her harness was inspected and passed, but the adjustment settings had been loosened, which wouldn't be obvious until mid-load. Her hydration pack had been emptied. Her radio had a fault coded into the secondary channel that would produce static at exactly the wrong moment during the joint communication exercise. Sarah discovered all 3 issues at 590 minutes before the exercise began. She fixed them without saying a word. She fixed them methodically, thoroughly, and she noted in her yellow legal pad exactly what had been altered when she discovered it, and what the likely operational impact would have been if she hadn't caught it. She was building a case, brick by brick. At the morning briefing, Victor stood up and in front of the full group announced what he described as an equipment accountability concern, suggesting that the commander's gear had been improperly prepped by her support staff, and that this raised questions about her operational readiness protocols. Several heads turned to Sarah. She looked at him calmly. "Thank you for raising that," she said. "Equipment integrity is critical. I'll include it in the weekly compliance report." She turned back to the training schedule. "Now let's talk about today's joint fire exercise." Victor sat down, but his eyes were still working, still calculating. He hadn't expected her to absorb it. He'd needed her to react, to get defensive, to go emotional. Because that was the card he was holding, the idea that under pressure she would reveal herself to be something smaller than her file. Instead, she kept getting larger. By the end of week 1, the operators were dividing into camps. Not openly, nobody was openly declaring loyalty in a joint military training environment. But there were the ones who watched Sarah's performance numbers and stopped arguing, and there were the ones who took their cues from Victor and kept their distance. Private First Class Mackenzie Brennan was in neither camp. Mackenzie was 22 years old, fresh out of advanced infantry school, and one of 3 female service members enrolled in the program. She was exceptional, top of her class in marksmanship, 3rd overall in her training cohort for obstacle performance. But she'd spent her first week at Ridgeway trying to make herself invisible, because she understood very clearly that she was being watched differently than the men around her. She ran harder to prove the same thing. She spoke less to avoid being dismissed. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the course. On day 6, she made a mistake during the live fire sequence, a targeting error under time pressure that any operator could make, particularly in their first week. She corrected immediately and finished the drill without incident. Victor Harris made sure it was mentioned in the afternoon debrief in detail with editorial commentary. "That's the kind of hesitation," he said, looking at Mackenzie directly, "that gets people killed, and it's exactly why some people should not be here." Mackenzie's face went still. She didn't look away from him. She also didn't respond because she knew that anything she said would be used as evidence of either weakness or insubordination. Sarah had been listening from the back of the room. She let 2 full seconds of silence pass after Victor finished. Then she spoke still from the back without walking forward because she didn't need to. "Corporal Webb made a targeting adjustment error on day 3, she said. Her voice was flat and precise. Sergeant Torres had a communication protocol failure on day 5, both corrected and continued. Both were not mentioned in debrief." She paused. "Private Brennan corrected her error within the drill window and completed the sequence. That is the standard. She met it." The room was very quiet. Victor's jaw moved slightly like he was organizing a response. Sarah didn't give him one. Moving on, day 7 schedule. That night, Mackenzie found Sarah in the equipment maintenance bay, which was technically closed after 2100 hours. The younger woman stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure if she was intruding. Sarah looked up from the harness she was inspecting. "You need something, Private?" "No, ma'am." Mackenzie paused. "Actually, yes. I wanted to say thank you for this afternoon." Sarah set the harness down. "Don't thank me for holding the standard, Brennan. That's not a favor. That's my job." Mackenzie nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, but you have to say it the way you did." "Yes, I did," Sarah said simply. Because the way it was framed was incorrect, and incorrect framing in an evaluation setting has consequences. I corrected the record, that's all. Mackenzie looked at her for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "You already are." A slight smile from the younger woman. Do you ever get tired of it, of having to be twice as good just to be taken halfway as seriously?" Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally, honest without decoration. "Every single day." She picked up the harness again. "Now go sleep, you've got a 4:30 start." Mackenzie left. Sarah continued working in silence. She didn't write anything in her yellow legal pad that night. Some things you just have to carry. Day 9. The shove happened on day 9. It was a live demonstration, hand-to-hand combatives integration, designed to show how Navy and Marine close quarters techniques could be unified under a common framework. Sarah was demonstrating a counter-aggression sequence for the assembled group. She was mid-explanation, facing forward, gesturing toward the floor markers that mapped out the technique spacing. She never saw Harris move. What she felt was the full weight of a 230 lb man hitting her from behind. Both hands flat between her shoulder blades, full force. The kind of shove that was designed not just to knock someone down, but to knock someone apart, to make them look small, to make everyone watching see something fragile fall. She went face first into the mud. The room exploded in a different kind of silence. The silence of 47 people holding their breath. Sarah lay still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pushed herself to her hands, then to her knees, then to her feet. She didn't reach up to wipe the mud from her face immediately. She stood first. She found her footing first. Then slowly she reached up and cleared her eyes. She turned around. Victor Harris was standing 5 ft behind her, arms at his sides, face composed in an expression of performative innocence. "Slipped, Aiden," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. "Sorry about that, Commander." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Sarah looked at him. Her expression was completely unreadable. No anger, no humiliation, no visible emotion of any kind, just eyes that were very, very clear. And then she did something no one expected. She nodded. Once. Small, like she'd confirmed something to herself. "Resume positions." She said to the group. Her voice was level. "We're continuing the demonstration." She turned back to the floor markers and she kept teaching. Victor Harris stood there for a moment too long watching her back, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something that wasn't satisfaction. Something closer to the first cold edge of understanding that he had just made a serious mistake. He just didn't know yet how serious. That evening, Sarah sat in her office with the door closed and the lights low. Her yellow legal pad was open. She added 3 lines. Day 9, 13:47 hours, deliberate physical assault, full witnesses. Cameras active, confirmed 3 angles. She underlined the last part twice. Then she put the pen down. She picked up her phone and made one call, not to report the incident, not to file a complaint. She called the base's joint legal observer, a lieutenant colonel named Patricia Haynes, and asked a single question. "If I submitted a formal request for a controlled CQB demonstration with full observer protocol and named a specific opponent, what's the approval process and timeline?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. 48 hours for approval, assuming commanding officer sign-off. Haynes said carefully, and video documentation would be automatic under the Joint Observer Protocol, standard procedure. "Thank you," Sarah said. "I'll have the request on your desk by 600. She hung up, opened her laptop, and began to write the most precisely worded training request anyone at Camp Ridgeway had ever received. She wasn't reporting what had happened. She was setting the table for what came next. Because Sarah McKinley had understood something in that moment when she stood up from the mud and looked at Victor Harris. Something that no amount of bias, no amount of sabotage, no amount of deliberate humiliation had managed to teach him. She wasn't the one being tested. She never had been, he was, and he had just failed in the worst way possible by thinking that knocking someone down meant you were winning. He had no idea. She had been studying him for 9 days. His habits, his timing, his preferred angles of approach. The way he planted his feet when he was about to move aggressively. The way his left shoulder dropped a fraction of a second before his weight shifted. She had been waiting, not out of fear, not out of patience, out of something much more dangerous, strategy. And the trap was already set. All he had to do was walk into it. The training request landed on Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Haynes' desk at 5:58 hours, 2 minutes before Sarah had promised it. Haynes read it once. Then she read it again. Then she picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, set the cup down, and read it a 3rd time. It was the most precisely constructed document she had seen in 22 years of military legal observation. Every word chosen, every clause accounted for. The request named Victor Harris specifically as the demonstration opponent. It cited Joint Training Protocol, Standard CQB, the guidelines, and 3 separate regulatory frameworks that authorized the exercise under full video documentation. It was not aggressive. It was not accusatory. It was surgical. It was the kind of document that could only be written by someone who had already anticipated every possible objection and neutralized each one before anyone thought to raise it. Haynes put the document down, stared at the wall for a moment, and then picked up her phone. "Commander McKinley," she said when Sarah answered. "Good morning, Colonel. I've read your request." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I want a straight answer." "Always. Is this a training exercise?" Sarah's voice didn't waver. "It is a formal, documented, observer-certified joint CQB demonstration consistent with the program objectives and standard integration curriculum. Every element of it is by the book." Another pause, longer this time. "Approved," Haynes said finally. 48 hours. "Thank you, Colonel." Sarah hung up. She didn't smile, she didn't exhale in relief. She simply opened her laptop and began reviewing footage, not of herself, of Victor Harris. She had requested access to all training video archives from the past 4 years under a standard program review protocol, a request so routine that nobody questioned it. What those videos contained was 9 years of Victor Harris in motion. His stance under pressure, his preferred attack angles, the way his weight transferred before a strike, the micro tells he didn't know he had, the habits that had calcified into instinct. She had watched 40 hours of footage in the past 9 days. She knew him better than he knew himself. And now she had 48 hours left to make sure she was ready for the one variable she couldn't fully predict, the version of Victor Harris that would show up when he thought he had an audience and an easy win. That version, she suspected, would be the most dangerous one clears throat, and the most useful. Day 10 began with the kind of morning that sets people on edge before anything has happened. Cold air, low cloud cover, the particular gray quality of light that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The operators filed into the briefing room at 4:30, and the atmosphere was different. Snort's word had moved through the base the way word always moves through a military installation. Fast, precise, and slightly distorted by the time it completes its first circuit. Most of the operators knew about the shove by now, and they knew about the request. The Marines who were loyal to Victor had framed it one way: she's looking for a legal escape hatch because she knows she can't perform. The SEALs and the operators who'd been quietly watching Sarah's numbers frame it differently. They said it quietly among themselves in the kind of language that military people use when they're acknowledging something they haven't fully processed yet. She's not running from it. Petty Officer First Class Aaron Cole said to his rackmate at 4:15, lacing his boots in the dark. She's walking toward it with a camera. His rackmate, a Marine Staff Sergeant named Diaz, didn't answer for a moment. Then, if she's wrong about herself, this is the worst decision she'll ever make. Cole finished his boot, and if she's right, Diaz didn't answer that one either. But he thought about it for the rest of the morning. Victor Harris received the formal notification of the approved demonstration at 700. His adjutant handed him the document without comment, which was smart because Victor's face, when he read it, was not the face of a man who had expected this development. He read it standing up in the middle of the motor pool with 3 of his senior NCOs nearby. He read it once, folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and said very quietly, "Fine." His senior NCO, Gunnery Sergeant Mark Thayer, who had served with Victor for 11 years, and could read him the way a musician reads sheet music, felt something cold move through his chest. Not because Victor looked angry, because he didn't. He looked certain. He clears throat, looked like a man who had been handed exactly what he wanted. That certainty Thayer thought might be the most dangerous thing about this whole situation, but he didn't say that. He nodded. He moved on. That was what you did with Victor Harris. You moved on and you hoped he was right about himself. The morning session was a joint land navigation exercise, GPS-denied map, and compass only six-man teams in mixed SEAL Marine configurations. Sarah had designed it specifically to force communication across branch lines, because the point of the program was integration, not competition, and she had not lost sight of that for a single day despite everything that was being done to distract her. She ran the exercise from a mobile command position, monitoring radio traffic tracking teams through checkpoint confirmations, logging everything. She was at all times exactly what she was supposed to be, the commander of a training program executing her mission. Mackenzie Brennan was on Team 4 paired with the Corporal Webb and 4 other operators. She navigated them through the first 2 checkpoints clean and fast, reading the terrain the way someone reads a language they were born into. Webb, who had started the program skeptical of everyone and everything, found himself following her pace without consciously deciding to. "You're fast with the compass," he said at the 3rd checkpoint checking in. "My dad taught me," Mackenzie said, not slowing down. He had this thing he said, if you can't find your way without a signal, you don't really know where you are, you just know where your phone thinks you are. Webb almost laughed, almost. "Your dad military, 23 years Army," she said, 2 purple hearts. "He still gets up at 04:30 every morning, can't sleep past it." She glanced at the map, left at the ridgeline, they went left. Webb didn't say anything else for a while, but something had shifted. That was what Sarah understood that Victor never would. Integration doesn't happen in demonstrations. It happens in small moments. In the morning before the cameras are on, in Clear's throat, the language people share when they stop performing and start working. She was building something day by day, brick by brick. And Victor was still trying to tear down the scaffolding, not realizing the structure was already standing. He made his next move at 1400 hours during the afternoon briefing. He stood up without being called on a deliberate breach of protocol and addressed the room as though Sarah wasn't in it. "I want to talk about standards," he said, voice carrying easily. "Specifically, I want to talk about the gap I'm seeing between what this program says its standards are and what's actually being applied on the ground." Sarah didn't move. She let him continue. "I've seen targeting errors go without consequence. I've seen timing failures in the obstacle sequence that would have failed any Marine candidate in my previous program, and I've seen those failures excused or worse, defended in the name of." He paused. The pause loaded with meaning, equity. The room was very still. Sarah looked at him. "Do you have specific performance data to support that?" "I have eyes," Victor said. "Data, Sergeant Harris, not impressions, data." Her voice was calm, not aggressive, just precise. "If you have documented performance failures that haven't been addressed through proper evaluation channels, submit them in writing by end of day, and I will review every single one personally." She looked at the room. "That's how the standard works. It doesn't operate on impressions. It operates on documented performance. Anyone who doesn't understand that distinction is welcome to review the program charter." She picked up her pen. Moving on, Victor sat down, but Thayer noticed something. He noticed that 3 of the younger Marines, the ones who'd been taking their cues from Harris all week, had not looked at Victor after that exchange. They'd looked at their notes. That was new. That was something. At 16:30, Sarah requested a private meeting with Thayer. Thayer arrived not knowing what to expect. He sat down across from Sarah in her small office and waited. "You've been with Sergeant Harris for 11 years, she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'm not going to ask you to evaluate him. I'm not going to ask you to say anything that puts you in a difficult position." She looked at him directly. "I'm going to ask you one thing and you can answer it or not." Thayer nodded slowly. "In 11 years, Sarah said, has he ever been wrong about a person and then admitted it?" Thayer was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence itself was an answer. "Once," he said finally. 2019, young Lance Corporal came in with attitude. Harris dismissed him early. The kid went on to distinguish himself in theater. Harris, he didn't say it to the kid, but he said it to me. He paused. He said, "Thayer, I called that one wrong, Mark." Sarah nodded. "Thank you," she said, "and that's all." Thayer stood, then hesitated. "Commander, why did you want to know that?" Sarah looked at her yellow legal pad. Because it tells me something about what's possible, she said quietly. Dismissed, Sergeant. He left. She sat alone and wrote one word on a fresh page, possible. Day 11, Victor's next escalation was more sophisticated and more ugly. He didn't do it directly. He never made that mistake twice. Instead, word began circulating through the base quietly, through the informal channels that military environments breed as naturally as they breed hierarchy. That Commander McKinley's selection for the program had involved direct political intervention. That Admiral Caldwell had been pressured by Pentagon diversity initiatives. That her file, impressive as it appeared, contained evaluations that had been adjusted upward by commanders who didn't want career trouble. It was a whisper campaign. Deniable, untraceable, effective. By day 11's morning formation, Sarah could feel it in the room. The slight recalibration in how some of the younger operators held themselves around her. The half-second longer it took for responses to come when she gave direction. The microscopic withdrawal that happens when people are reassessing what they think they know. She had anticipated this, too. She hadn't anticipated how much it would sting. She was human. That was the part no tactical preparation fully accounted for, the raw, unglamorous reality of standing in a room full of people who are quietly deciding you are a fraud, and having to perform with absolute precision, while that judgment sits on your chest like a stone. She went to the obstacle course at 04:45 that morning before anyone else arrived. She ran it, then she ran it again. Then a third time, not to prove anything to anyone watching. Nobody was watching. She ran it because physical exertion was the one language her body understood when her mind was too loud. When she crossed the finish line the third time and bent forward with her hands on her knees, breathing hard, she wasn't thinking about Victor Harris or the Whisper campaign or the demonstration in 36 hours. She was just breathing, just alive, just here. After a long minute, she straightened up, looked at the empty course, and said quietly to no one, "You don't get to decide what I am." She walked back to the operations building. She had work to do. Cole found her at 700 at the equipment staging area. He was one of the SEALs who hadn't taken sides explicitly, one of those operators who processed information slowly and thoroughly, and who you'd rather have as a quiet ally than a loud one. "Commander," he said, "Cole." He was quiet for a moment, like he was figuring out the right way to say something. "I've been around a while," he said finally, 12 years. "I've served under 5 commanderment. 3 of them were the best I ever worked with." He paused. "You're working at a level I don't see often." Sarah kept organizing her equipment. "Thank you. I just want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens in that demonstration, there are people in this program who have been paying attention, not to the noise, to the performance." She looked at him then. "What happens in that demonstration," she said carefully, "is a training exercise, that's all it is." Cole held her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he walked away. But he smiled just slightly with his back to her, and Sarah allowed herself exactly 1 second of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. Then she went back to work. The afternoon of day 11 brought the ugliest moment yet, and it had nothing to do with Sarah directly. Victor Harris conducted what he called an informal performance review of Team 4 in front of the full group. He went through the land navigation results one team at a time, and when he reached Team 4, his language shifted. He cited Mackenzie Brennan's checkpoint timing from the 3rd station, a gap of 40 seconds between her team and Team 2, and framed it with exquisite precision as a leadership failure. "When the point element slows, the whole team slows," he said. "That's a basic principle that apparently requires further emphasis." Mackenzie sat with her back straight and her hands flat on her knees. She did not look at Sarah. Webb sitting beside her did something nobody expected. He raised his hand. Victor looked at him with an expression that suggested he found the gesture mildly surprising. "Webb, Sir, Team 4's checkpoint 3-time accounts for a terrain adjustment I called not Private Brennan. I redirected us around the North Ridge because I read a drainage issue that wasn't on the map. That added the time. The navigation execution was correct." He paused, just wanted the record accurate. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. Victor looked at Webb for a long moment, noted, he said, and moved on. But Mackenzie, for the first time since arriving at Ridgeway, felt the weight on her chest shift. Not disappear, shift. There was a difference. The difference between carrying something alone and carrying it alongside someone who's decided to stand next to you. She looked at Webb after the briefing. He shrugged. The record should be accurate, he said, like it was obvious. That's all. It wasn't all. Both of them knew it, but neither of them said so because some things don't need words to be real. Day 12, 18 hours before the demonstration. Sarah spent the evening doing something that looked from the outside like nothing at all. She sat in the empty briefing room alone in the dark for 45 minutes. No phone, no legal pad, no laptop. She was running scenarios, not physical scenarios, mental ones. She had long ago reached the ceiling of what additional physical preparation could add. What she needed now was the version of herself that would walk into that warehouse tomorrow. And regardless of what Victor Harris did, regardless of what the room felt like, regardless of how loud the pressure was, execute without hesitation, without emotion. Without giving him a single frame of footage he could use. She thought about the shove, the mud, the 2 seconds on the ground, the moment she stood up and turned around and looked at him and understood, but with crystalline clarity, exactly what she was dealing with, and exactly what it would cost to deal with it correctly. She thought about Mackenzie Brennan sitting with her back straight. She thought about Webb raising his hand. She thought about Thayer saying once in 2019, he said, "I called that one wrong." She thought about what she was actually trying to build here. Not a reputation, not a record, not a symbol. A standard. A real one that held regardless of who was being evaluated, regardless of what they looked like, regardless of what assumptions preceded them into the room. That was the work. That was always the work. She stood up, walked to the door, turned off the light. In his quarters across the base, Victor Harris was awake, too. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling with his arms crossed over his chest, running his own calculations. He was confident. He was experienced. He outweighed her by nearly 100 lb and had 30 years clear's throat of combatives training that had been tested in actual hostile fire environments. He was also, for the first time, slightly uneasy, and he didn't know why. Thayer knocked on his door at 2200. Victor let him in. They stood in the narrow space, and Thayer said what he'd come to say. "I want you to be careful tomorrow." Victor looked at him. "You think she can take me?" "I think," Thayer said carefully, "that she's been very calm for someone who's been treated the way she's been treated. And in my experience, when someone that capable is that calm, it's not because they're weak." He held Victor's gaze. "It's because they're ready." Victor was quiet. "I've handled operators twice her size," he said finally. "I know," Thayer said. "That's not what I'm worried about." He paused at the door. "I'm worried about what she's been doing for 9 days while you were making noise." He left. Victor lay back down, stared at the ceiling. For the first time, a thought moved through his mind that he didn't invite and couldn't fully dismiss. What if I've been looking at this wrong? He pushed it away, but it came back. At 300, he was still awake. The trap was already set. The table was already laid, and somewhere across the base, Commander Sarah McKinley slept for exactly 6 hours. No more, no less, because she had planned for tomorrow the way she planned for everything, completely, precisely, without leaving anything to chance. She had studied him for 12 days. He had spent 12 days performing for an audience, and tomorrow, in front of every camera, every operator, every person on that base who had made a decision about who she was before she ever opened her mouth, she was going to show them the difference between those two approaches. Not to humiliate him, not to win an argument, but because the truth in her experience had a specific weight. And when you set it down in front of people who have been holding something false, the contrast is impossible to ignore. She was going to set the truth down tomorrow and let everyone in that room decide what to do with it. 600 hours, day 13. Sarah was already dressed when her alarm went off. She'd been sitting on the edge of her bunk for 20 minutes, not thinking, not reviewing. Not preparing, just sitting, breathing the way she'd learned to do before every operation that mattered, not because it calmed her down, but because it reminded her that she was a person, not a machine, and that the difference between those two things was actually the source of her strength, not a weakness to be managed. She stood up, checked her uniform once in the mirror, not for vanity, but for precision. She was not going to walk into that warehouse with a single thing out of place. Not one loose thread, not one unintentional signal. Everything she wore, everything she carried, everything about the way she moved today would be read by 47 people looking for information. She intended to control every piece of it. She picked up her yellow legal pad, looked at the last line she'd written. Clears throat, possible. She set it down, walked out. The base was already moving. You could feel it, that particular quality of energy that runs through a place when something significant is about to happen, and everyone knows it and nobody is saying it directly. Operators moved through the morning with slightly too much purpose. Conversations were shorter. Eye contact lasted a fraction of a second longer than usual. At 06:45, they are past Sarah in the corridor outside the operations building. He nodded. She nodded. Neither of them said anything. But as he passed, he slowed just slightly, not enough to stop, just enough to register, and she understood without needing the words that the nod meant something more than military courtesy. It meant, I see you, I'm watching. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm paying attention. That was enough. In the equipment bay, Mackenzie Brennan was prepping her kit for the morning session. Hands moving through the familiar sequence of checks with the automatic competence of someone who has done it so many times it lives in muscle memory. When Sarah walked past, Mackenzie didn't stop moving, but she said quietly without looking up, Good morning, Commander. Morning, Brennan. A pause. Mackenzie's hands kept moving. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that I've been watching since day one. She finally looked up. Her eyes were steady. I know what I've seen. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Focus on your kit, she said. You've got a full session this morning. Yes, ma'am. Sarah walked on, but she carried that with her. She carried all of it. Webb raising his hand there at the door, Cole in the staging area, Mackenzie's voice just now. She carried every small act of quiet witness like ballast, not because she needed validation, because she was human, and humans, even the most prepared ones, need to know that someone in the room is looking at the actual picture and not the frame someone else built around it. 7:30 hours. Victor Harris ate breakfast alone. This was unusual. Victor was not a solitary man by nature. He was a creature of formation, of tradition, of the particular social architecture that military culture builds over decades. He had always eaten with his NCOs, had always been the center of the table in the way that men who have earned genuine respect can be without effort. This morning, Thayer arrived at the mess hall, looked across the room, saw Victor at a corner table by himself, and made a decision. He got his tray, walked over, and sat down across from him without asking. Victor looked up, didn't say anything. They ate in silence for a full 2 minutes. Then Victor said without preamble, She's going to try to embarrass me. Thayer chewed, swallowed. Is that what you think this is? What else would it be? Thayer was quiet for a moment. She could have reported the shove on day 9, he said. She had witnesses, she had camera confirmation, she could have had you removed from the program and possibly charged within 24 hours. He set his fork down. She didn't do that. Victor said nothing. She could have gone to Caldwell directly, Thayer continued. One call, you'd have been on a transport back to Lejeune before the week was out. He looked at Victor steadily. She didn't do that either. She's building a bigger case, Victor said, more public. Or, Thayer said, and his voice shifted into something quieter and more deliberate. She's doing exactly what she said she'd do when she walked into that briefing room on day 1, running the program by the standard. He picked his fork back up. I'm just saying there's more than one way to read this. Victor pushed his tray back. She's not going to win, Mark. Thayer looked at him. Define Clear's throat winning, he said. Victor didn't answer. He left the mess hall without finishing his food. Thayer watched him go, and the cold feeling from day 10 moved through his chest again, heavier now, more specific. He was starting to understand something that Victor hadn't allowed himself to see yet. This wasn't a contest between two people, it was a demonstration. And the audience wasn't just the 47 operators in that warehouse, it was history. And history in Thayer's experience was very unforgiving of people who ended up on the wrong side of it. 900 hours. The morning training session ran as scheduled, live fire accuracy drills 300 mixed position shooting time sequences. Sarah ran the session with the same unbroken precision she'd applied to every session before it. She called corrections without heat. She acknowledged strong performance without favoritism. She made 3 tactical adjustments to the drill sequence mid-exercise based on real-time observation, and all 3 of them worked exactly as she intended. Cole put 3 rounds inside a 4-in group at 275 and did not make a sound. He just ejected, cleared, and moved to the next position like it was routine, because for him it was. But he glanced at Sarah after, and she gave him a single nod, and that was the whole conversation, and it said everything it needed to. Webb, who had been one of the skeptics who had arrived at this program with the particular brand of competitive suspicion that elite operators develop like armor, finished the time sequence 2 seconds under his personal best. He didn't know why. He thought it might have something to do with the fact that, for the first time in 13 days, he was training without the constant background noise of institutional politics. Sarah had stripped that away not through speeches or motivational language, but through the simple, relentless application of one standard applied identically to everyone. When you remove the politics, what remains is performance, and the performance in this program was extraordinary. 1,100 hours. Victor Harris arrived at the warehouse at 10:57, 3 minutes early. He was alone. He told his NCOs he didn't need an audience before the fact, only after. That was pride. That was the particular blindness of a man who has never fully understood the difference between confidence and certainty. Confidence is what you carry into the unknown. Certainty clears throat is what you feel when you've already decided how something ends. Victor had certainty. Sarah arrived at 10:59. She entered through the north door, paused just inside the threshold, and looked at the space. 43 operators in position. The Joint Legal Observer team in the upper left corner, Haynes among them, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. 3 camera positions, one covering the full floor, one angled from the right side wall, one overhead. Every angle accounted for. She had requested those camera positions specifically. She walked to the center of the floor. Victor was already there, arms loose at his sides, weight distributed evenly, the posture of a man who is ready to move. She stopped 6 feet from him. For a moment they just looked at each other, 43 people not breathing. Then Sarah turned to face the assembled group and spoke at normal volume clearly for the cameras and for the room. This is a joint CQB demonstration under full observer protocol. The purpose is to document and evaluate integrated counter-aggression technique as it applies to the combined SEAL Marine curriculum. Both participants have consented in writing. Standard safety boundaries apply. Haynes, confirm. From the corner, confirmed. Cameras are active, observer protocol is in effect. Sarah turned back to Victor. Ready when you are, Sergeant. Victor looked at her. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes, a final assessment. She could see it. She had expected it. He was looking for the tell, the hesitation, the thing that would confirm what he had already decided. The thing that would prove to him that she was what he thought she was. She gave him nothing, absolutely nothing. Victor moved. He came at her fast the way he always moved when he was serious. Not the shove from day 9, not a humiliation tactic, but a genuine combative's approach. The kind of full commitment movement that ends things quickly when it works. He went for her right shoulder angling to drive her back and down, using his mass the way he always used it, like a fact that couldn't be argued with. And Sarah was not there. She moved laterally 2 steps before he completed the approach, a redirect so precise and so timed that it looked to everyone watching less like a defensive response, and more like she had known exactly where he was going to need to be before he got there. Because she had. 40 hours of footage, 12 days of observation. She knew his left shoulder drop. She knew the micro shift in his weight distribution that preceded a right side drive. She had studied him the way you study a language you intend to speak fluently, not just the words but the grammar, not just the moves but the logic behind them. She redirected his momentum, not against it, with it. Used the full weight of his commitment against the direction he was committed to, the way water doesn't fight the rock, but finds the path around it. He went past her, and her hands were on his right arm before he'd registered that his target wasn't where he'd aimed. And then the floor was coming up faster than anything in his 30 years of experience had prepared him for. The takedown was clean, controlled, no excess force, no performance, just physics executed with absolute precision. The pin that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. She released him, stepped back, stood up straight, and said nothing. The warehouse was so silent you could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. 43 people, not one of them moved, not one of them made a sound. Victor Harris lay on the floor for a moment, just a moment, less than 2 seconds, and in that moment something happened to his face that they are watching from the third row had never seen in 11 years. Something cracked. Not dramatically, not the way things crack in movies. The way things crack in real life quietly at the point where pressure has finally exceeded structural capacity. Victor got up. He was methodical about it. He pushed to his knees, got a foot under himself, stood. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. Same expression she'd had since day one, was strong, clear, direct, without performance. "Again," Victor said. The word came out of him in a way that it surprised even him. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't denial. It was something raw or than that, the word of a man who has just had the ground shift under his entire understanding of himself and needs desperately for it to have been a mistake. Sarah shook her head. "We have what we need," she said quietly. "This demonstration is complete." She turned toward Haynes. "Colonel." Haynes was already writing. "Documented," she said without looking up. "Thank you, Commander," and that was it. That was the whole thing, no celebration, no speech, no moment of public triumph. Just a woman turning back toward the work, same as she'd been doing for 13 days, same as she intended to keep doing for however many days remained. But the room was different now, and everyone in it knew it. Cole exhaled slowly and looked at the ceiling. Webb stood very still with his arms at his sides, and the expression on his face was the one people wear when they've just seen something they will think about for the rest of their lives. Mackenzie Brennan, standing in the back left corner, did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, but her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, and she pressed her lips together and looked at Sarah's back and thought, "There it is. That's what it looks like." And Thayer looked at Victor. Victor was still standing in the center of the floor, and he was looking at his hands. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just looking at them. The way a person looks at something they thought they understood completely and are suddenly not sure about anymore. Thayer had served with this man for 11 years. He'd seen him angry, proud, grieving, exhausted, triumphant, and devastated. He had never seen him look the way he looked right now, like he was taking inventory, like something had just been broken and he was trying to figure out what it was. 15 hours, 15 minutes after the demonstration ended. Sarah was in her office alone, door closed. She sat at her desk and did not open her laptop. She did not pick up her legal pad. She sat with her hands flat on the desk surface and let the adrenaline work its way through her system because that was what bodies did, and there was no shortcutting it. She had done what she set out to do. That should have felt clean, and it did mostly. But underneath the clean feeling was something more complicated. That's way that always is when you have won something that required you to hold yourself at a very particular tension for a very long time. You let the tension go, and what's left isn't just relief. There's exhaustion in it, and something that might, if she was honest, have been a little bit like grief. Not for herself, for the whole situation, for the fact that it had been necessary, for the weight of what it had cost everyone in that room to arrive at a moment of truth that should have been established on day one. She was still sitting there when the knock came. She already knew who it was. "Come in," she said. Victor Harris opened the door. He was not the same man who had walked into that warehouse 40 minutes ago. The physical dimensions were identical, still 230 lb still. The face that had looked at her with such certainty on day one. But the certainty was gone. In its place was something she recognized because she had seen it before in other people, in other rooms, after other moments of truth. Reckoning. He stood just inside the door, didn't sit. She didn't invite him to. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said. "I know," she said, a long pause. "I've been in this branch for 31 years, he said. "I've been wrong before, I don't always handle it well." He stopped, seemed to be working through something. "Day 9, that wasn't a slip." "I know that too," she said. He nodded. "I thought." He stopped again, looked at the floor briefly, looked back at her. "I thought if I could get you to react, it would prove what I already believed." He said it plainly without dressing it up. "And you didn't react, so I escalated and I kept escalating." He paused because I couldn't figure out how to be wrong. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you've said since day one." He nodded once. "I know." He stood there. "What happens now?" This was the question she had been preparing for longer than any physical drill, longer than any tactical scenario, because the answer to this question was the whole point. It was the thing that separated correction from punishment, growth from destruction, leadership from performance. She leaned back in her chair. "The formal review is going to happen," she said. "That's not in my control. The video documentation is already with Haynes and the process is going to run its course." She looked at him steadily. "What I can control is my recommendation." Victor waited. "I'm not going to recommend court-martial," she said. "I'm not going to recommend separation." He blinked. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't that. "What I'm going to recommend," she continued, "is restructured duty. You will remain in the program under my command as assistant instructor." She paused. "You will train alongside the people you have been dismissing. You will be evaluated on performance, same as everyone else, and you will be held accountable through the standard, not through punishment." Victor stared at her. "Why?" It was a genuine question. She could hear it. "Because destroying you doesn't fix anything," she said. "It makes me look decisive, and it makes you a cautionary tale, and it changes nothing about the system that produced this situation." She held his gaze. "But if you actually correct, if you do the work, if you sit in this program and let yourself see what's actually here instead of what you decided was here, then something real changes. Not just for you, for every Marine you've trained and every operator who's been watching you for 2 weeks to see how someone with your experience handles being wrong." Victor said, "Then, you have a choice," she said. "You can fight the review and lose everything, or you can accept the recommendation and earn something back." She picked up her pen, clears throat. "I'd suggest the second option, but it's yours to make." He stood there for another long moment. She could see him processing it, the whole shape of it, the unexpected geometry of a situation that had not ended the way he had designed it to end. Then he said very quietly, "You could have ended my career today." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because 2019, she said. "They are told me." Victor's expression shifted. Something moved through it that was complicated and private and not something she was going to narrate for him. Let him carry it. He'd earned the weight of it. "The Lance Corporal Bull," he said after a moment. "You told Thayer you called it wrong. She said that means you're capable of seeing it." She looked back at her desk. "That's worth something to me." Victor nodded slowly once. "I'll accept the recommendation," he said. He turned toward the door. "Harris," she said. He stopped. "This doesn't end today," she said. "This is the beginning of the hard part, the part where you actually have to show up differently every day in front of people who remember what you were." She paused. "That's harder than anything that happened in that warehouse." He was quiet. "I know," he said, and he left. Sarah sat alone for another minute. Then she opened her yellow legal pad to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. Day 13. Then she picked up her phone and called Admiral Caldwell's office. Because the formal review needed her recommendation on record before the process got away from her. And the process moved fast once it started, and she had never once in her career let the process move faster than her intentions. She had work to do, same as always. That was the thing about real leadership. It never looked the way the movies said it would. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a moment. It was the next task and the one after that, and the willingness to keep showing up for the work even after the dramatic moment had passed and everyone else had gone home. Clear's throat, Sarah McKinley picked up the phone and kept going. 1400 hours. Day 13, 2 hours after Victor Harris walked out of Sarah's office. The formal review process moved exactly as fast as Sarah had predicted. Lieutenant Colonel Haynes submitted the incident documentation to the Joint Oversight Committee by 12:30 hours video files from all 3 camera angles, the signed observer protocol, the written consent, forms the training request, with its precise regulatory citations. And a 9-page summary of documented incidents, spanning the full 13 days of the program. The 9 pages had not been assembled in 2 hours. They had been assembled over 12 days, one entry at a time, in a yellow legal pad that Sarah had been maintaining with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the truth only wins when it's undeniable. It was undeniable. The committee convened an emergency session at 13:30. Sarah was not in the room. She had submitted her recommendation in writing at 12:45, 1-page, clear, specific, and structured in a way that gave the committee exactly 2 options: accept her proposal in full, or reject it and explain in writing why a decorated Tier 1 commander's considered professional recommendation did not meet the threshold for institutional adoption. She had not given them a third option. That was intentional. While the committee deliberated, Sarah ran the afternoon session. The operators arrived at 1400 to find their commander already at the training floor. Same as every other afternoon, same posture, same precision, same unbroken standard. If they expected her to be elsewhere in a meeting, in a legal proceeding, anxiously waiting for institutional validation, they were wrong. She was here same as always. Cole arrived early and stood near the equipment line watching her set up the afternoon's joint communication drill. After a moment, he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "The committee's already meeting." "I know," she said, not looking up. "Aren't you?" He stopped. "What?" Cole, nervous, he said, then immediately, "Sorry, that was a stupid question." She finally looked at him. "No," she said, "it wasn't." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm always nervous before something that matters. I've just learned that nervous and ready aren't opposites." She looked back at the equipment. "Get in position." He went, but he carried that with him, Clear's throat, that small, honest piece of her that she didn't have to give and gave anyway. It mattered to him more than she would ever know. The afternoon Clear's throat drill ran for 90 minutes. Joint radio communication under simulated signal interference, the kind of exercise that sounds technical and is actually deeply human, because it requires people who have different communication cultures to find a shared language under pressure. Marines tend to be direct and sequential. SEALs tend to be adaptive and improvisational. The friction between those 2 styles in a real operational environment could cost lives. Sarah had designed this drill to surface the friction, not eliminate it. She wanted the operators to feel where the gap was, not have it smoothed over by a protocol that pretended the gap didn't exist. Webb was partnered with a SEAL named Rodriguez. They were completely incompatible for the first 20 minutes. Webb kept waiting for Rodriguez to confirm receipt of each transmission before moving to the next. Rodriguez kept transmitting multiple updates in rapid sequence and then going silent for 30 seconds, which drove Webb insane. By the midpoint of the drill, they were both frustrated in that particular way that competent people get frustrated when they can't make something work and they don't understand why. Sarah watched from the command position. She let it run. She didn't intervene. At the 70-minute mark, something shifted. Webb stopped waiting for full confirmation and started acting on partial information. Rodriguez slowed his transmission cadence by about 15% and added 1 extra confirmation beat. Neither of them announced this adjustment. Neither of them asked permission. They just found it, found the middle of themselves. Their last 4 transmissions of the drill were clean, coordinated, and fast. Sarah noted it in her log without comment. She would tell them about it at debrief. Not as praise as data, because the most useful thing she could give them wasn't applause. It was an accurate description of what they had actually done so they could understand it well enough to replicate it. 45 hours. The committee sent a runner. The runner, a young administrative corporal named Finch who looked like he'd been handed a grenade and told to remain calm, found Sarah at the debrief and handed her a sealed envelope without a word. She took it, set it on the table, finished the debrief sentence she was in the middle of, then when she reached a natural pause in the instruction, she opened it. She read it without visible reaction. Then she folded it and put it in her breast pocket and continued the debrief. Cole watched her face the entire time. He could not read a single thing from it. It was only afterward, when the operators had dispersed, and Sarah was alone at the command table, that she allowed herself to exhale long and slow and quiet. The way you exhale when you've been holding your breath for 13 days without fully realizing it. The committee had accepted her recommendation in full. Victor Harris would not be court-martialed. He would not be separated from service. He would be formally censured. That part was non-negotiable, and she hadn't tried to negotiate it, and placed on a 60-day probationary assignment as assistant instructor under her direct command. His performance would be evaluated by the same standard applied to every other participant in the program. At the end of 60 days, the committee would review his record and determine next steps. It was not a slap on the wrist. A formal censure on a 31-year record was not nothing. The probationary structure was not comfortable, but it was corrective rather than terminal. It gave him a road back. She had fought for that road, not because he deserved it automatically, because the system needed it to exist. Day 14 began the hard part she had warned him about. Victor Harris showed up at 04:30 in the position of assistant instructor. He stood at the back of the formation instead of the front. He received direction instead of giving it. He answered to a rank that in a different world, the world he had occupied for 31 years, would have answered to him. And he did it. He did it quietly, which surprised people. They had expected defiance, subtle or otherwise. They had expected the performance of compliance that is really just defiance wearing a different mask. What they got was something harder to categorize. Victor Harris showed up and did exactly what was asked. No more, no less. He didn't perform humility because he wasn't built for performance in that direction. He just functioned professionally, correctly. It was Thayer who understood it first. "He's not doing it for show," he told Cole on day 15 during a water break. "He's doing it because he decided to. That's different." Cole looked across the field at Victor, who was running a smaller group through a combative sequence with the same technical precision he'd always had. "He looks like himself," Cole said, "just quieter." "Yeah," Thayer said. "That's what I mean." What Victor was actually experiencing during those first days was something he didn't have language for yet, because it was outside the vocabulary his life had built for him. He was experiencing the specific discomfort of being in a room where your previous certainty has been proven wrong, and having to keep showing up in that room anyway. Not because you're forced to, because you chose to, because somewhere in the conversation in Sarah's office, something had shifted in the architecture of his understanding, and he couldn't go back to the blueprint he'd been living by. It was uncomfortable in a way that physical training never was. You could master physical discomfort. You could push through it, outwork it, overcome it with sufficient preparation and will. This kind of discomfort didn't yield to force. It only yielded to time and honesty, and Victor Harris had very limited experience with the second one. On day 16, he made his first mistake as assistant instructor. It was during a joint land navigation review. A young Marine named Castillo, quite precise the kind of operator who processed information internally and performed externally, made a navigational decision under time pressure that was technically correct but unusual. Victor's instinct, the 31 years of instinct, was to flag it as an error. He opened his mouth, then he stopped. He looked at the route Castillo had chosen. He ran it forward in his head. He understood about 3 seconds in that it was actually a more efficient solution than the standard approach that had accounted for a slope variable that the textbook route didn't. "That works," Victor said, flat, direct, no editorial. Castillo looked at him like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "I said it works," Victor repeated. "Log it as an alternate solution." He moved on. Castillo logged it. But he looked at the back of Victor's head for a long moment after, and then he looked at Mackenzie, who was 2 positions to his left, and she had heard the whole thing, and she gave Castillo a look that said, "Yes, that just happened, and yes, it matters." It mattered more than either of them knew. Sarah was not present for that exchange. She heard about it later from Thayer, who reported it with the careful neutrality of a man who was trying not to overinterpret something important. She listened without expression. Wrote one line in her legal pad when he was done. Day 16, he called it right. Unprompted, she didn't say anything else about it, but she thought about it at 300 the next morning, when she couldn't sleep the way you think about small things that might be the beginning of large ones. Day 18 brought the first real test of the new structure. It came from an unexpected direction. Not from Victor, not from within the program. It came from outside. A journalist credentialed Pentagon approved there to observe the integration program for a military affairs publication arrived on base with a camera crew and a very specific angle. Someone had talked. Sarah didn't know who, and at this point it didn't matter. The story was already formed before the journalist arrived. Political appointment leads controversial women in combat program forces showdown with veteran Marine. The journalist requested interviews with program participants. Sarah approved the request. That decision surprised everyone, including Haynes, who called her immediately. "You understand what angle they're working?" Haynes said. "Yes," Sarah said, "and you're approving full access. Interview format only, no training footage, standard media protocol." She paused. Yes, a longer pause from Haynes. "Why?" "Because the truth is better than my version of the truth." Sarah said, "If I control the access, I control the story, but the story becomes about the control. If I open the access, the story becomes all what's actually here varies." She paused. "What's actually here is good." "Let them see it." Haynes was quiet for a moment. "You're either very confident or very foolish," she said. "Maybe both," Sarah said. The journalist, her name was Dana Reyes, and she was sharper than her framing suggested, spent 2 days moving through the program. She watched the drills. She sat in on briefings. She conducted individual interviews with operators across both branches. She expected to find division, resentment, a program fracturing under ideological pressure. What she found was something that took her 2 days to fully articulate to herself because it didn't fit the frame she'd arrived with. She found people working. She found Webb and Rodriguez running communication drills together with the specific shorthand efficiency of people who found their shared language. She found Castillo explaining his alternate navigation solution to 3 other operators who listened with genuine technical interest. She found Mackenzie Brennan at the front of a combative sequence, demonstrating a technique with the quiet authority of someone who has learned that competence is its own argument. And she found Victor Harris at the back of the formation running a smaller group calling corrections with flat precision, and once nodding when one of the younger Marines got something exactly right. On the second afternoon, Reyes requested an interview with Victor. He agreed, which also surprised people. They sat in the operations building camera rolling, and Reyes asked her questions with the practiced neutrality of a journalist who is actually looking for the story rather than confirming one she already wrote. "You were publicly identified as one of the skeptics of Commander McKinley's appointment," she said. "I was more than a skeptic," Victor said. His voice was level. "I was hostile. I made decisions based on assumptions that I didn't adequately examine." Reyes blinked. That was not the answer she'd prepared a follow-up for, and now Victor was quiet for a moment. "Now I'm the assistant instructor," he said, "which is where I should have started probably, given what I didn't know." He looked directly at the camera, not performing, just direct. "She's the best commander I've worked under in a field training environment." I could think of no way not that's not a comfortable thing to say. I'm saying it because it's accurate. Reyes leaned forward slightly. "What changed your mind?" Victor said. "She did, not by arguing with me, by not needing to." When Reyes finally sat down with Sarah late on the second day, she had already revised her story twice in her head. She was for the first time in a while genuinely uncertain about the shape of the thing she was about to write. "You gave us full access," she said to Sarah. Sarah looked at her. Because this program is doing exactly what it was designed to do, she said, and I'd rather you see it than hear me describe it. Reyes looked at her notes. Harris says you're the best commander he's worked under. Sergeant Harris is still on probationary status, Sarah said evenly. His evaluation is ongoing. That's not a denial, Reyes said. No, Sarah said. It isn't. A pause. Reyes tried a different angle. You've been offered media recognition twice since the demonstration. You've declined Clear's throat both times. Why? Sarah looked at her steadily. Because recognition isn't the point, she said. The program is the point. The standard is the point. She paused. If I start performing for cameras, I stop leading, and these people deserve leadership, not performance. Reyes wrote that down, then looked up. One last question, off the record if you want. Ask it. Was it worth it, all of it, the shove, the sabotage, the 13 days of that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Ask me at graduation, she said. Day 22. A twist nobody saw coming. It arrived in the form of a memo from the Pentagon's Joint Force Integration Office. A bureaucratic document with the specific weight of something that has been decided several levels above the people it will affect most directly. Sarah read it at 600, standing at her desk, and her expression went through a very controlled series of changes that ended in something flat and very still. The memo informed her that the joint program was under review for restructuring. A senior committee convened 3 weeks ago before the demonstration, before Haynes' documentation, before any of this had been examining whether the integration model was cost-effective. Their preliminary recommendation was to revert to separate branch training tracks with quarterly joint exercises rather than a full integrated curriculum. In other words, to undo exactly what this program was building. Sarah put the memo down, picked it up again, read the date of the committees, convening 3 weeks ago before any of the events of the past 2 weeks, before the demonstration, before the proof. Before Webb and Rodriguez found their shared language, before Castillo's alternate solution, before Victor Harris said, on camera, the most honest thing he'd said in 31 years. None of that had been visible to the committee when they made their preliminary recommendation. None of it existed yet, but it existed now. She picked up her phone and called Caldwell directly. No adjutant, no scheduling request. His direct line, which he had given her personally on the day he assigned her the program. He answered on the second ring. McKinley. Admiral, I've read the restructuring memo. I assumed you had. The committee's evidence base is 3 weeks old, she said. The program's current performance data postdates their entire deliberation. I know. Then you know their preliminary recommendation is based on an incomplete picture. A pause. What are you asking me, Commander? I'm asking for 30 days, she said. 30 days to complete the program under current structure and submit a full performance data set that includes the last 3 weeks. Let the committee evaluate the actual results before they recommend dismantling the process that produced them. Silence on the line, long enough that she counted it. 7 seconds. Send me the data package by end of day, Caldwell said finally. I'll take it to the committee chair personally. Thank you, Admiral. Don't thank me yet, he said. The committee doesn't like being second-guessed. With respect, sir, Sarah said, I'm not second-guessing them. I'm giving them information they didn't have. That's different. Another pause, shorter this time. End of day, McKinley, he hung up. Sarah stood at her desk and did not move for exactly 30 seconds. Then she sat down, opened her laptop, and began assembling the most comprehensive performance data package that Joint Program had ever produced. Every drill time, every accuracy score, every communication drill result, every documented instance of cross-branch technique integration. Webb and Rodriguez's communication evolution charted over 18 days. Castillo's alternate navigation solution with full technical annotation. Brennan's performance trajectory from day 1 to day 22. And at the back of the package, 3 pages she had written carefully over the previous week. A qualitative assessment of what the data represented in human terms. What it meant that 2 operators from different branches had found a shared language under pressure. What it meant that a 31-year veteran had revised a judgment based on evidence. What it meant that a 22-year-old woman had stood in a program designed to doubt her, and performed at a level that made the doubt irrelevant. She submitted the package at 17:47 hours, 13 minutes before end of day. Then she went back to the training floor because the program was still running and her people still needed their commander present. Day 25. Victor Harris did something no one expected. He asked Mackenzie Brennan to demonstrate a technique in front of the full group during a combative session he was running as assistant instructor. He called her name, asked her to take the floor, and then stepped back and let her work. Mackenzie looked at him for a half-second. Just a half-second, the kind of pause that contains an entire conversation. And then she walked to the center of the floor and demonstrated the counter-aggression sequence with a precision and economy of motion that made the room go quiet in a different way than the warehouse had. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition. The silence of 40-plus operators watching something done exactly right and knowing it. When she finished, Victor said, "That's the standard. Everyone should be able to do that in their sleep by day 30. He didn't say her name again. He didn't make a speech about it. He just moved on, back to the instruction. Mackenzie returned to her position. Cole, standing to her left, said under his breath, "He just did what he should have done on day 1. Mackenzie kept her eyes forward. "Yeah," she said quietly, "better late than never." Cole looked at her profile. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't carrying the weight she'd arrived with either. Something had been set down, not forgotten. You don't forget 13 days of that, but set down, exchanged for something more useful. That evening, Sarah found Mackenzie at the equipment bay, same place they'd talked on day 6. Mackenzie looked up when Sarah walked in, and the expression on her face was different from every other time Sarah had seen her. Not guarded, not performing, just open. "Commander," she said, "Brennan." Sarah leaned against the equipment rack. "How are you doing?" Real answer. Mackenzie thought about it. "Tired," she said honestly. "In a good way, the kind of tired that means something happened." She paused. "He asked me to demonstrate today." "I know." Did you suggest that to him?" Sarah shook her head. "No," Mackenzie absorbed that. "So he did it himself. He did it himself." A long pause. Mackenzie looked at her hands. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she said. "Like this got too good too fast, and something's going to come along and reset it back to how it was." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That's not an irrational feeling," she said. "Systems don't change overnight. What happened here is real, but it's also fragile. It'll need people who keep showing up to protect it." She looked at Mackenzie directly. "People like you." Mackenzie looked at her. "Why me?" "Because you were here from day 1, Sarah said. "Because you ran harder and spoke less and carried more than you should have had to, and you did it without quitting. And because clears throat, people watch that, even the ones who didn't show it." She pushed off the equipment rack. "The program needs what you know, not just your scores. What you know about doing this when it's hard." Mackenzie was quiet for a long time after Sarah left. Then she went back to her kid. There was still work to do. That was the thing this program had taught her. The thing Sarah had been demonstrating since 04:30 on day 1. And that was slowly becoming the language of the whole room. The work doesn't stop because a dramatic moment passed. It doesn't stop because someone acknowledged you, or because the committee approved a recommendation, or because a 31-year veteran finally called it right. You show up. You hold the standard. You do the next thing. And then you do the one after that. Day 28. The committee's response to Caldwell's data submission arrived at 800. Sarah read it standing up, same as she'd read the restructuring memo 6 days earlier. This time her expression did something different at the end. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter than both of those. The committee had agreed to extend the program's current integrated structure through full graduation and submit a new recommendation based on complete performance data. The restructuring proposal was tabled indefinitely. 30 days. She had asked for 30 days. They'd given her the rest of the program. She set the memo down, picked up her yellow legal pad, wrote day 28. They're going to let it finish. She capped the pen, then she picked up her radio and called the morning formation, because graduation was 17 days away and there was still work to do. Day 29. Snort's 17 days to graduation. The base had a different feeling now. Not soft, or nothing about Camp Ridgway had ever been soft, and Sarah would never have wanted it to be. But there was a quality to the air in the mornings that hadn't been there in the first 2 weeks. Something that the operators themselves couldn't quite name, but that all of them felt when they laced their boots in the dark and headed to formation. Clear's throat, something that felt, if you pressed them to find the word, like purpose without apology. Like a group of people who had stopped spending energy on performing and started spending it entirely on the work. Sarah felt it too. She felt it every morning when she walked from her quarters to the operations building and heard the base coming alive around her. The specific rhythm of 40-plus operators moving through their preparation with the synchronized efficiency of people who have found their shared language. It had taken 29 days. It had cost more than she'd expected and less than she'd feared. And it was real. That was the thing she held on to when she was tired, which was often. It was real, not a performance of integration, not a photograph opportunity, the actual thing. She had 17 days left to make sure it held. 4:30 formation on day 29. Sarah stood at the front and looked out at the assembled group, 43 operators, 2 branches, 1 standard, and felt the particular quality of that silence that she had learned to read over the past month. It wasn't the silence of day 1, which had been the silence of people withholding judgment while they decided what they were dealing with. It wasn't the silence of day 9, which had been the silence of shock and calculation. This was the silence of people who were ready, fully present, pointed in the same direction. 17 days, she said, no preamble, 17 days to graduation. Everything we've built gets tested in the final evaluation sequence, and the final evaluation sequence does not curve, does not account for what you intended to do, and does not care about your history in this program. It cares about what you can execute on the day. She looked across the formation. We are going to spend these 17 days making sure the answer to that question is everything. She paused. Move out. They moved. Victor Harris, standing at the back left corner of the formation in his assistant instructor position, watched them go. Then he fell in behind them, same as every day for the past 16 days. No fanfare, no resistance, just present, doing the work. Thayer had started to stop watching him with the careful monitoring attention of someone waiting for a collapse. He watched him now, the way you watch someone you've recalibrated your expectations of, with something that was getting closer, slowly to something like respect. On day 30, something happened that Sarah hadn't planned for and couldn't have. It happened during the joint urban movement drill, a complex exercise that required 2-man teams from mixed branches to clear a simulated structure in coordinated sequence, communicating through hand signals and radio in real time. It was one of the most technically demanding exercises in the curriculum, and Sarah had scheduled it for day 30 specifically because the operators would need every day of the preceding month to be ready for it. Webb and Rodriguez were Team 7. They moved through the first 3 stations with the clean efficiency of people who have over 18 days of drilling, essentially built a new shared language from scratch. Their communication was minimal, precise, and perfectly timed, the kind of coordination that looks easy to watch and is brutally hard to produce. At Station 4, the simulation introduced a variable that wasn't in the briefing. Standard practice, real operations don't follow briefings, and the evaluation was designed to test adaptive response, not scripted execution. The variable was a simulated non-combatant in the movement path, which required an immediate recalibration of the clearance sequence without breaking the team's communication rhythm. Webb saw it first. He gave Rodriguez the signal for halt. Rodriguez acknowledged. Webb gave the secondary signal for a route to signal. They had developed themselves over 10 days of drilling that wasn't in either branch's standard protocol. It was theirs, built from their specific experience of where the 2 communication cultures met and where they diverged. Rodriguez acknowledged. They rerouted, completed the station, moved to 5. The whole adaptation took 11 seconds. Sarah watched it from the command position and wrote nothing in her legal pad. Some things you just carry without needing to record them because you already know they're the point. Victor Harris was standing 3 FT to her left. He watched the same sequence. He was quiet for a long moment after Webb and Rodriguez cleared Station 5. Then he said, without looking at Sarah, in the flat voice he used when he was stating a fact rather than making a point, "They built their own protocol." "Yes," Sarah said, "that's not in the curriculum." "No," she said, "it's better than the curriculum." Victor was quiet again. "I would have flagged that as a deviation on day 1 at dawn," he said. "I know." He looked at her then. "That would have been wrong." "Yes," she said, "it would have." He nodded once, looked back at the drill, said nothing else. But that exchange, 45 words, less than a minute, no audience, no cameras, was the most significant conversation Sarah had had since the one in her office on day 13, because it wasn't performance. Victor Harris was not the kind of man who performed accountability. When he said something like that in that tone, in that context, it was because he meant it. And meaning it for a man built the way he was built cost something real. She filed it away, not in the legal pad, just in herself. Day 34 brought the first of the final evaluation sequences, a 3-day series of assessments covering every core competency of the integrated curriculum: physical performance, tactical execution, communication, decision-making under pressure, and joint operational planning. Each operator evaluated individually and as part of mixed teams. No branch curve, one standard. On the morning of day 34, Mackenzie Brennan was the third operator through the obstacle course. Her time was 17 minutes and 8 seconds under full combat load. That was elite performance by any measure in any program. The evaluators recorded it without comment because they were professionals, and professionals don't editorialize during assessment. But Cole, standing at the finish line checkpoint, looked at his stopwatch and then looked at her and said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "Top 5 Brennan, all programs." Mackenzie bent forward, hands on knees, breathing hard. "What?" she managed. "Top 5 obstacle times in this evaluation's history," he said. "All genders, all branches." She straightened up, looked at him. He was serious. She could tell he was serious. She didn't say anything. She couldn't quite write then, but she nodded once and pressed her lips together and walked to the next station. Cole watched her go and thought about how much energy she had spent over 34 days trying to be invisible, and how completely spectacularly that plan had failed. Some people, he thought, are just too good to disappear. The only question is whether the room around them is big enough to see it. This room finally was. Day 36, midpoint of the evaluation sequence. The twist that reshaped everything again. A second memo arrived from the Pentagon, not the restructuring committee this time. The Joint Force Integration Office, a different body higher in the chain, had been monitoring the program's performance data since Caldwell submitted Sarah's package. They had been watching for 36 days, quietly, without announcing themselves. The memo was addressed to Admiral Caldwell. He forwarded it to Sarah with a single line of his own text appended. "I believe this is what you asked for 30 days ago. Caldwell." Sarah read the memo at 05:45, standing at her desk, her coffee going cold beside her. The Joint Force Integration Office was recommending that the Camp Ridgeway integrated curriculum be formally adopted as the foundational model for a new national joint training standard. If approved by the Secretary of Defense, which the memo indicated was likely given the performance data, every elite training program in the country would be restructured around the framework Sarah had been running for 36 days. Not a single program, not a pilot project, a national standard. She read it twice, set it down, picked up her coffee, which was cold, and drank it anyway. Then she sat down and stared at the wall for about 90 seconds. She was thinking about a thing Admiral Caldwell had said to her during their first meeting before she'd taken the program. He'd said, "The goal is never one program. The goal is what one program proves is possible." She'd written it down at the time and then mostly forgotten it, the way you forget things that are too large to hold on to during the immediate work. She was holding it now. She called Caldwell. "I read it," she said when he answered. "I assumed," he said. "This is going to bring attention to the program," she said. "Press attention, political attention. People who want to use this as a symbol are going to find it very convenient." "Yes," Caldwell said. I need you to protect the operators from that, she said. Not from recognition, they've earned recognition. Clear's throat, from being made into symbols before they've finished becoming operators. They need to graduate as the thing they are, not the thing someone else needs them to be for a story. A pause. You're asking me to manage the announcement timing. I'm asking you to let them graduate first, she said. Let them finish. Let the evaluation stand on its own. Then announce whatever needs to be announced. That's 13 days, Caldwell said. Yes, sir. Another pause, longer. Agreed, he said finally. 13 days, then the office will proceed. She thanked him, hung up. She did not tell the operators about the memo. She did not tell Haynes. She did not tell Victor or Thayer or Cole or Mackenzie. She told no one. Because they needed to finish as themselves, not as the people who were about to become the national standard. That was a weight that would change how they moved through the last 13 days, and the last 13 days deserved to be clean. She carried the memo alone. It was, she thought, one of the harder things she had done in the whole program. Day 40, the final week. Victor Harris requested a private meeting with Sarah. He came to her office at 1800 hours after the day's training had concluded, and he sat down this time without being invited to, because something had shifted in the architecture of their relationship over the past 4 weeks. Not into friendship exactly, and not into comfort, but into the specific territory of people who have been through something real together and understand each other's weight. He put a single sheet of paper on her desk. She looked at it. It was a formal request, properly formatted through the correct channels for a letter of evaluation. Specifically, a letter assessing his performance during the probationary period. He needed it for the committee's 60-day review, but that wasn't what the meeting was about. She could see that immediately. She put the paper aside. What do you actually want to say, Harris? He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has been preparing something for a while and is now at the moment of saying it, and finding it harder than he anticipated. I want to say he started, then stopped, tried again. I spent 31 years believing I had a clear picture of what made someone qualified to lead, and I believed that picture was objective, based on real criteria. Performance, experience, demonstrated capability under fire. He looked at his hands briefly, the same gesture Sarah had noticed in the warehouse. What I didn't account for was how much of what I called objective was actually preference, shaped by 31 years of being in rooms that looked a certain way. Sarah said nothing. Let him get there. I dismissed you before you opened your mouth, he said. I made a decision based on a picture in my head that had nothing to do with your record, your capability, or anything observable about you. He looked up at her. And then I spent 2 weeks trying to make reality conform to the decision I'd already made instead of letting reality change the decision. He stopped. I want to say that clearly, not for the record. To you, the office was very quiet. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. I heard you, she said. He nodded. The letter will be accurate, she said. Your performance since day 14 has been professional, technically sound, and on several occasions genuinely instructive for the group. She picked up the request form. I'll have it done before the review date. He stood to leave. Harris, she said. He turned. What you just said in here, she said, is harder to do than anything that happened in the warehouse. Both of them required courage. I want you to know I understand the difference. Victor Harris looked at her. Something moved through his face, not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. Something snorts more like the expression of a man who has just been seen accurately for the first time in a very long time and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Thank you, Commander, he said. He left. Sarah sat alone for a minute, then she opened her legal pad. She'd been keeping it since day 1, 40 pages now dense with notes, observations, performance data, and the occasional single word that captured something too important to lose. She turned to the last blank page, thought for a moment, then she wrote day 40. He said it. No cameras, no audience, no benefit, he just said it. She capped the pen, closed the pad. Day 45. Final evaluation results posted. 43 operators had completed the program. 43 had passed. Not because the standard had been lowered, the evaluator's documentation confirmed explicitly, and in writing that no criterion had been adjusted, waived, or modified for any participant at any point during the program. 43 operators had completed because 43 operators had risen to meet a standard that was designed to find out exactly what they were made of. The results were posted at 700 on the main operations board. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a list with names and scores, the way results have always been posted in training programs that respect the people they're evaluating. Mackenzie Brennan's name was 5th from the top. Cole found her reading the board at 7:15, standing perfectly still, looking at her name in that position, and he stood beside her without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "5th overall, 43 people, 2 branches." "I see it," she said quietly. "How does it feel?" She thought about it. "Like I always knew it was there," she said. "The number. I always knew what I was capable of. I just needed." She stopped. "I needed the room to stop arguing with itself long enough for me to do the work." Cole nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what happened." Webb arrived at the board 30 seconds later, found his own name, and was quiet in the specific way of someone whose emotional response is too large for the available vocabulary. He stood there for a full minute. Then he looked at Mackenzie, then at Cole, then back at the board. "We did this," he said simply. "Yeah," Cole said, "we did. Day 46, graduation -1. Sarah spent the day on the training floor, not because there was anything left to train. The evaluation was complete, the results were posted, the program was functionally over. She spent the day on the floor because she didn't know how to not be on the floor. It was where the work had happened. It was where the truth had been demonstrated. It was in some way she couldn't articulate fully the place that it cost the most and given back the most, and she wasn't ready to stop standing in it. Thuron found her there at 1600, running a dummy drill sequence alone, working through a technique she had been meaning to refine since day 3 and had never had a quiet moment to address. He watched her for a minute from the doorway. "You know the program's over," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Today it's still running." He walked in, stood nearby. "What happens to you after graduation?" "I go back to my unit," she said. "They're assigning me to the curriculum development team for the new standard." Thuron raised his eyebrows slightly. "New standard." She realized she'd said too much. "There's an announcement coming," she said carefully. "After tomorrow, you'll hear about it then." He looked at her. He was smart enough to understand the shape of what she wasn't saying. His eyebrows clear his throat settled back down. "That big?" He said quietly. "Yeah," she said. "That big." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you know it was going to end up here when you started?" Sarah stopped the drill, thought about it. "No," she said. "I knew what the program needed to be. I knew the standard it needed to hold. I knew what was possible if the people in it were given the space to actually perform." Thayer looked at him. "I didn't know it would work. I just knew it was worth trying." Thayer nodded slowly. "Harris is going to be okay," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever comes next for him, he's going to be okay. He's changed. Not the way people change when they're forced to, the way they change when they decide to." "I know," she said. "That's why I wrote the letter I wrote." Thayer looked at her. "What did you say?" "The truth," she said. "Same as always, day 47, graduation 800 hours." The operators assembled in dress uniform in the main operations building, 43 of them, standing in the configuration they had learned to stand in over 47 days. Not by branch, not by rank, but by team, mixed, integrated, the configuration that the program had built them into. Sarah stood at the front of the room. She looked Clear's throat at them for a long time before she spoke. She looked at Webb, who was standing with his weight evenly distributed and his eyes forward in the posture of someone who has become, over 47 days, very sure of where he belongs. She looked at Rodriguez beside him, who had arrived at this program with the contained, coiled energy of someone accustomed to operating alone, and was now standing with 2 inches less space between himself and Webb than he'd left on day 1. She looked at Castillo and Torres and Finch, who had graduated from running memos to completing a full evaluation sequence, and she looked at Cole, who caught her eye and gave her the smallest possible nod. She looked at Mackenzie Brennan, standing 5th in the front row, back straight, chin level, the expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and set it down somewhere permanent. She looked at Victor Harris, standing at the back of the room in his assistant instructor position, and found him already looking at her. His expression was the flattest she had ever seen it, stripped of the certainty that had been its default setting for 31 years, but not empty. Replaced by something quieter, something that might in time be better, she took a breath. 47 days, she said. 43 of you won standard. She paused. I'm not going to tell you what you accomplished because you already know. I'm not going to tell you what it means because you've been living what it means for 6 weeks. She looked across the room. What I will tell you is this: what was built in this room does not belong to me. It does not belong to any branch, any rank, or any decision made above this level. It belongs to the 43 people standing in it. You built it. You held it. You earned it every single day without exception. The room was perfectly still. This program will have consequences that extend beyond this base, she said carefully. She had thought about how much to say. She had decided on enough to honor what they'd done, not enough to make them into symbols before they'd had time to simply be graduates. What you demonstrated here, the capability, the integration, the standard, has been seen by people who have the ability to make it mean something larger. She looked at them steadily. But that's later. Right now, in this room, you are 43 operators who showed up and did the work. That is the thing that made everything else possible. Don't forget the order of operations. She paused one final time. Dismissed as candidates, recognized as graduates, carry the standard. The room came to attention in a single unified movement, not because they were ordered to, but because some responses are too large to contain. And attention is what the body does when it needs to honor or 43 operators, 2 branches, 1 motion. Sarah held the salute for 3 seconds, then she released it. Afterward, in the courtyard, in the specific chaos of a graduation that military culture produces, handshakes, photographs, the particular loud relief of people who have been under pressure for a very long time and have finally been given permission to exhale. Sarah stood slightly apart. Not isolated, not performing distance, just taking a moment to be in it before it was over. A journalist, not Ray's, someone new. Someone who had gotten through on press credentials without her knowing appeared at her elbow with a recorder and a question she had heard before. Commander McKinley, you've been offered a promotion and a media feature. You've declined both. Why? Sarah looked at the courtyard at Webb and Rodriguez standing together laughing at something. At McKinsey, who had found her father on a video call in the corner and was holding the phone with both hands and saying something that made the man on the screen put his hand to his face at Victor Harris, standing with Thayer, not laughing, not performing, just standing. Present, accountable, still here, she looked back at the journalist. I don't need to be a symbol, she said. I need to be effective. She put her hand briefly on the journalist's shoulder. Not unkind, just conclusive, and walked back into the courtyard toward Cole, who had found her coffee somehow, and was holding it out to her with an expression that contained a full conversation's worth of everything in the last 47 days had been. She took it. It was warm. She drank it and stood in the courtyard with her people, and for the first time in 47 days, she was not thinking about the next thing. She was just in this one fully, without strategy, without the yellow legal pad, without the calculation. Just a commander in a courtyard with 43 graduates who had shown the world what a standard actually looked like when you refused to lower it for anyone, including the people who tried to use it against you. That night, Sarah sat in her empty office for the last time. The yellow legal pad was on the desk in front of her. 47 pages of notes, observations, data, single words, and 2-word lines that had carried the weight of entire days. She opened it to the very first page. Day 1. What they want, a reaction. What I'll give them, nothing. She read through it, all 47 pages. It took her 22 minutes. When she finished, she closed it, held it for a moment, then she put it in her bag. Not because she needed the data anymore, because it was the record of something real. Something that had happened fully and completely regardless of whether anyone had believed it was possible. She turned off the light, walked out, and behind her in 47 days of entries was the proof of something that no amount of doubt, sabotage, deliberate humiliation, institutional inertia, or 31 years of certainty had been able to disprove. You cannot break someone who never needed your approval to begin with. You cannot stop someone who has already decided what they're building. And you should never, not ever, not under any circumstances, not when you are certain and prepared and surrounded by people who agree with you, push someone from behind without first understanding exactly what you have chosen to wake up. Victor Harris had pushed Commander Sarah McKinley face first into the mud on day 9. She had stood up in 2 seconds. It had taken him 38 days to understand what that meant, but he understood it now. They all did. And that understanding earned through 47 days of one standard held, without exception, by a commander who never once needed to raise her voice to make herself impossible to ignore, was the only thing in that building that would outlast all of them. Not the footage Clear's throat, not the memo, not the national standard announcement that would come in the morning. The truth set down plainly in front of everyone who had tried to argue with it. Undeniable, permanent, done.